Hello everyone, it's nice to see you all again. Hope you're all well. Just going to wait 1 or 2 minutes for some more people just coming in now, and we'll get started. The format of the talk will be much like before, 45 or so minutes, followed by Q&A. Okay, so I think that's everyone. So, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for the third session of our virtual conference. Today we have Miles Hentrup presenting his paper, How to Think in a Circle on the Circularity of Hegel's System. Miles is assistant professor at Florida Gulf Coast University, and his research focuses on the work of Hegel, particularly on Hegel's reception of Kant's critical project and on the development of critical philosophy in Germany from Kant to Marx. Miles, thank you very much for presenting today. The floor is yours.
All right. Greetings, everybody. I'm going to try to share my screen here. So let me see if that's going to work. And then we'll get started. All right. Doing okay? Okay, great. All right. So I just want to begin by thanking the organizers for making this event possible, and to all of the presenters who have already contributed to this event, and all the attendees. Thanks for your attention, and thank you for all the helpful discussion in thinking through these difficult questions posed by this conference. I also want to just quickly thank Rob Dunphy before beginning for letting me know about this great group and bringing this event to my attention. I'm really excited about learning about this group, and I've been really enjoying myself so far. I've been learning a lot, and I'm looking forward to our discussion continuing. So for my presentation, I decided to try to take full advantage of the online and Zoom format and put together a PowerPoint presentation rather than a more traditional conference paper. This format it's a bit new to me, just a FYI, but my hope is that I think that it's going to help us ignite our imaginations a bit and allow us to gain some further clarity on some of the fundamental philosophical questions at issue in this conference. So Hegel invokes the figure of the circle in order to illustrate crucial aspects of his philosophical system. He employs the figure to characterize this system as a whole and each part within it. He appeals to this figure in describing the conception of truth that emerges within such a system. And he even turns to this figure in articulating the philosophical method by which he attempts to justify his system of philosophy. So I want to begin by just looking at a few of these suggested passages where Hegel invokes the figure of the circle. So I'll begin by looking at what should be by now a pretty familiar passage where Hegel invokes the figure of the circle to describe the structure of the system. So this is from Encyclopedia Logic, section 15. Hegel says, each of the parts of philosophy is a philosophical whole, a circle coming to closure within itself. But in each of its parts, the philosophical idea exists in a particular determinacy or element. The individual circle, simply because it is in itself a totality, also breaks through the boundary of its element and founds a further sphere. The whole thus presents itself as a circle of circles, each of which is a necessary moment, so that the system of its distinctive elements makes up the idea in its entirety, which appears equally in each one of them. Next, I'd like to take a look at a passage from the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, where Hegel characterizes the truth that emerges within the system of philosophy as circular in nature. So Hegel says that the true is not an original unity as such, or not an immediate unity as such. It is the coming to be of itself, the circle that presupposes its end as its goal and has its end for its beginning, and which is actual only through this accomplishment and its end. And lastly, I want to look at two passages from the Science of Logic where Hegel invokes the figure of the circle in order to describe the philosophical method of the system, making use of the figure of the circle. So this first passage is from the introductory essay to the Science of Logic, with what must the beginning of science be made? Hegel says, essential to science is not so much that a pure immediacy should be the beginning, but that the whole of science is in itself a circle in which the first becomes also the last, and the last also the first. So here Hegel is suggesting that the scientific status of his philosophical system, that is, its claim to systematic necessity, is not so much an effect of achieving a presuppositionless beginning or deducing a self-evident first principle, but is accomplished somehow through its circular structure. Similarly, here at the end of the Science of Logic, in Hegel's discussion of absolute method, he once again invokes the figure of the circle. So he says here, by virtue of the method just indicated, the science presents itself as a circle that winds around itself, where the mediation winds the end back to the beginning, which is the simple ground. The circle is thus a circle of circles, for each single member ensouled by the method is reflected into itself, so that in returning to the beginning is at the same time the beginning of a new member. Indeed, one even finds the figure of the circle inscribed in the title that Hegel gives to his system of philosophy, the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences. Right, the circle is right there in the name of Hegel's philosophical system. But for all of Hegel's reliance on this figure of circularity, he gives little indication in his writings as to how he proposes to conceive of circularity. So in this presentation, I suggest two ways of thinking about circularity in hope of clarifying Hegel's invocation of this otherwise elusive figure. And in particular, I'm interested in examining the way that these two models of circularity raise fundamental philosophical questions concerning the nature of truth, the nature of justification, and regarding the limits of representation. Thus, in order to answer the main question posed in this conference regarding the exact circuit that Hegel's system purports to traverse, I suggest that we first raise the question of how Hegel proposes to think circularity. The first model I propose for understanding Hegel's conception of circularity is what I'm calling the reciprocity model. The reciprocity model can be easily represented in a spatial diagram. Its spatial representation is identical to the image of the Ouroboros, or the tail devourer. The Ouroboros is, of course, an image to which many philosophical and religious thinkers throughout history have considered to explore the reciprocity of birth and death, the reciprocity of day and night, of beginning and end, of part and whole, of stasis and change, of destruction and renewal. The ancient Egyptians first employed this image to capture the mystery of cyclical time. This is the first panel here. The Egyptian year begins with the onset of the flooding of the Nile in the summer. Through the flooding, the fruitfulness of the land is regenerated. The flooding of the Nile is thus, according to Egyptologist Jan Assmann, a key symbol of cyclical time, which does not irretrievably pursue one goal, but rather flows back into itself like a circle, and thus enables renewal, repetition, and regeneration. The Ouroboros appears throughout the tradition of Western Hermeticism more generally, and the tradition of Western mysticism, as a symbol for the coincidence of opposites. For thinkers in the tradition of Western Hermeticism, the Ouroboros came to symbolize the coincidence of life and death, of the microcosmic human and the macrocosmic universe, of the part and of the whole. So for instance, in the Chrysopoeia of Cleopatra, this is the second slide here, the second panel, Cleopatra, the 3rd century Greek philosopher and alchemist, not the more familiar historical figure, we see the Ouroboros along with the inscription inside here, Hentopon, right? Literally one, the all. To symbolize here the unity of the cosmos, the profound interconnectedness of all things. But also, in this example, in this Chrysopoeia of Cleopatra, this Yirmibes is also called upon to symbolize the intrinsic connection between base metals and gold, right? The traditional aspiration of alchemy. So more recently, philosopher of technology Andrew Feenberg has employed this image in order to represent the reciprocal process of co-construction he envisions taking place between technology and society. So here we have MC Escher's drawing hands image on the right. Feenberg says, insofar as social groups are constituted by the technical links that associate their members, their status is that of the drawn object in MC Escher's scheme. But they react back on those links in terms of their experience, drawing that which draws them. So now I want to consider how Hegel's invocation of the circle can be understood on the basis of the reciprocity model inspired by the symbol of the Yirmibes. The symbol of the Yirmibes suggests that the relationship between the head and the tail of the serpent is not just one of inseparable unity, but one indeed of reciprocity. In the symbol of the Yirmibes, the head and tail of the snake obviously coincide, as we can see in this image. But the symbol also suggests that the cycle or movement here runs in both directions. So after all, the Yirmibes can no more be said to be swallowing its own tail than it can be said to be growing out of its own mouth. And so by extension, I would suggest that this model encourages us to see the relationship between the beginning and the end of Hegel's logic, between pure being and absolute idea, as one of reciprocity. According to this model, pure being and absolute idea are not simply linked together in an indistinguishable unity, but rather pure being and absolute idea on this model co-determine or reciprocally influence one another. Analogy, this model suggests that we think the parts that together comprise the system of philosophical sciences as involved in a relationship of reciprocity. That's to say, each of the parts of the system, logic, nature, and spirit, mutually co-determine one another. On this model then, this reciprocity model, it is not just that spirit depends upon nature or nature upon logic, but that logic also depends upon spirit, and spirit reciprocally depends upon nature. Similarly, the reciprocity model also offers us a way of understanding the methodological circularity of Hegel's philosophy. So I want to return to one of the passages that we looked at a moment ago, where Hegel invokes the figure of the circle to characterize the method of proof or justification at issue in his system of philosophical science. So Hegel says here, essential to science is not so much that a pure immediacy should be the beginning, but that the whole of science is in itself a circle, in which the first becomes also the last, and the last also the first. Conversely, it follows that it is just as necessary to consider as result that into which the movement returns as to its ground. In this respect, the first is just as much the ground, and the last a derivative. Since the movement makes its start from the first, and by correct inferences arrives at the last as the ground, this last is result. So accordingly, to think Hegel's method of justification on this reciprocity model is to affirm not only that the consequent or the mediated conclusion of the logic, the absolute idea, depends upon its immediate ground or presupposition, pure immediate being, it is also on this model to affirm that pure being, the immediate ground and presupposition of the logic, depends upon or is self-grounded in the absolute idea, its ultimate conclusion. So the reciprocity model presents us, suggested, one way of understanding what Hegel means when he refers to the method of the system, the parts of the system, and the system as a whole as circular. It's one way, in other words, of conceiving of how the logical starting point and the logical ending point coincide in Hegel's system. On this model, they exist within a relationship of reciprocity or co-determination, in which the various extremes under consideration necessitate or imply their own opposite. But while this model may be helpful in allowing us to appreciate the necessary connection that Hegel identifies between the beginning and end of the logic, or the necessary unity that Hegel conceives of between the parts of the system of philosophical science, it also raises several philosophical difficulties. And so I want to discuss three of these today. First of all, reciprocity model encourages us to see Hegel's method as an instance of the sort of epistemic circularity that has often bothered philosophers seeking to clarify the proper norms of justification. It was Sextus Empiricus who, in his Outlines of Pyrrhonism, expressed this concern most forcefully when he argued that an epistemic circularity of this sort constitutes grounds for the suspension of judgment. Sextus presented this general argumentative schema in his discussion of the 5 modes of Agrippa, a system of 5 skeptical arguments or tropes that the Pyrrhonian skeptic leverages in order to challenge any claim to knowledge whatsoever. So Sextus refers to this skeptical argument as the 5th mode of Agrippa, or as the mode of reciprocity, or as the reciprocal mode. So here is how Sextus describes this skeptical mode or trope. He says, the reciprocal mode occurs when what ought to be confirmatory of the object under investigation needs to be made convincing by the object under investigation. Then, being unable to take either in order to establish the other, we suspend judgment about both. So the 5th mode of Agrippa, or the mode of reciprocity, is perhaps more familiar to us as the informal fallacy of circulus in probando, right, or arguing in a circle. This mode of argumentation, in which conclusion is shown to depend upon its initial premise, and its initial premise, in turn, is shown to depend upon its conclusion, is problematic because, rather than offering any external or independent grounds for justification, it simply begs the question, presupposing what it ought to prove. Moreover, this mode of argumentation, arguing in a circle, fails to be convincing. If one would not grant the premise in the first place, then neither would they grant any further claim depending upon this first premise. So there's problems with this way of arguing. Accordingly, if Hegel's system is circular in this sense, such that both the beginning and the end reciprocally depend upon one another for their justification, there would seem to be, at least on Sextus's account, an insurmountable problem of justification at its core. Alternatively, the reciprocity model might lead one to reject the problem raised by the 5th mode of Agrippa as itself problematic, right? So one might just reject this problem itself, seeing as the argument suggests that there is actually no possibility of ever locating an absolute beginning or self-evident first principle from which one could safely proceed in an investigation and which is not itself already under dispute. So one could, in other words, just bite the bullet and deny the possibility of ever locating such a self-evident first principle. At least in Hegel's early skepticism essay from 1801-1802, Hegel attempts seemingly suggest such a defense. So he says here, and this is the skepticism essay from 1801, since the rational, what ends up turning into reason for Hegel, since the rational is relation itself, the terms stand in relation to each other, which are supposed to ground one another when they are posited by the understanding, may well fall into the circle or into the 5th, the trope of reciprocity. But the rational itself does not, for within the relation, nothing is reciprocally grounded. So here at least Hegel appears to be quite familiar with the problem of vicious circularity, right, as it emerges within ancient philosophy. Nevertheless, the reciprocity model alone does not offer any obvious reason why we should think that the connection between the head and tail, presupposition and conclusion, ground and consequent, is such that it does not require any external or independent justification. So the reciprocity model doesn't make it clear why we could avoid this problem of epistemic circularity. It merely suggests that Hegel's method of proof or justification leads in a circle. So in the face of things, we are left with Sextus's question: which of these determinations must ultimately come first? Which of these moments or determinations is the ground or reason upon which the subsequent determinations depend? If Hegel cannot answer questions like these, then it would appear that the circle to which he appeals is rather vicious. However, even setting aside the problem of epistemic justification or epistemic circularity, one may still wonder whether the reciprocity model can account for the kind of development or progression that Hegel describes as taking place in the logic from pure being to absolute idea, or in the system as a whole, from logic to spirit. While the model correctly represents the necessary reciprocity between the head and the tail of the Yirmibes, and by extension, between pure being and absolute idea in the case of the logic, or between logic and spirit in the case of the system, the concept of that reciprocity alone cannot account for the development that occurs as thought travels its circular course. After all, to say that pure being and absolute idea co-determine one another or are related reciprocally is to consider these two moments of one and the same logical activity as separate and only externally related to one another. Similarly, to say that logic and spirit are reciprocally related, right along the lines of the reciprocity model, is to suggest that these constitute separate and externally related spheres of science. Indeed, this seems to be the same problem that Hegel himself identifies in his discussion of the category of reciprocity in the Logic of Essence. So here I want to take a look at a rather long passage from the Encyclopedia Logic, where Hegel is lamenting, or at least speaking to the limits of reciprocity. So Hegel says, if one does not move beyond considering a given content merely from the viewpoint of reciprocity, this is in fact an utterly conceptless way of behaving. One is then dealing merely with a dry fact and the requirement of mediation, which is prima facie at stake in the application of the relationship of causality, still remains unsatisfied. If it is considered more precisely, what is unsatisfactory in the application of the relationship of reciprocity consists in the fact that this relationship, instead of being able to hold as an equivalent of the concept, first needs to be comprehended itself. And this happens not by leaving the two sides of it as something immediately given. And this is what I'm suggesting the reciprocity model does, right? It leaves the two sides immediately given, but Hegel says, but instead, as was shown in the two previous sections, by coming to know them as moments of a third higher dimension, which is precisely the concept. So here, of course, Hegel is suggesting that the reciprocity model retains a kind of immediacy, right, between what it implies there's a reciprocal relationship between, which is why I'm suggesting it's not going to allow for any kind of development. Accordingly, if the moments joined together in the circle of philosophical science are only externally related, then it is unclear how there can be any true development from one moment to the next. We can only speak of development or progress, after all, where there is unity. Without this unity, however, there can only be alternation or fluctuation, but no true development. Here I would suggest that this is really the same metaphysical difficulty that once upon a time led Meno to deny the very possibility of learning in the paradox that bears his name, right? Meno's paradox. And the same difficulty, therefore, that leads Socrates in the Meno to introduce the notion of recollection or anamnesis. So, of course, from the Meno, how will you aim to search for something you do not know at all? If you should meet with it, how will you know that this is the thing that you did not No. So again, this is Meno's paradox, and I think the question that's being posed here is how, in other words, is a development from out of a condition of complete ignorance to a condition of knowledge at all possible, right? So what in other words occurs between the starting point of an inquiry and the discovery that marks its conclusion? Surely the premise and conclusion of an argument can be said to be reciprocally related, but what makes us think that a development has actually taken place? Without such an account, that is, of the development that occurs between the moments, the figure of circularity, therefore, raises the specter of eternal recurrence. Of course, from Ecclesiastes or Kohelet, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. So everything that has come into being will eventually pass away, and all that remains is the perpetual and endless repetition of this self-same cycle, right? This is the wisdom of the wisdom literature from the Hebrew Bible, but it's also, I would suggest, precisely a denial of the very possibility of development. On the problems I've introduced, I would also add here a third. Hegel frequently points to the limits of symbolic representation and the general deficiency of symbols in comparison with the determinacy of thought. In the Science of Logic, for example, Hegel discusses the relative deficiency of symbolic representation as compared with conceptual comprehension, citing the use of the circle as a symbol, as a case in point. So here's from the Science of Logic. Hegel writes, "To take numbers and geometrical figures, as has often been done, as mere symbols, the circle, for instance, of eternity, the triangle, the Trinity, is on the one hand harmless enough, but on the other hand, it is foolish to believe that more is thereby expressed than can be comprehended and expressed by thought. As profound a wisdom, as profound a meaning may lie in such symbols, it is still up to thinking alone to extract this wisdom and to bring it to light. A wisdom that is only implicit in them, and not only in symbols, but in nature and in spirit. In symbols, the truth is still clouded and veiled by the sensuous, and only in the form of thought does it become totally manifest to consciousness. The meaning is only the thought itself." So here Hegel's suggesting that symbols are abstract. They require interpretation and do not in any case permit of the same sort of clarity or precision of meaning that comes with conceptual comprehension. Hegel actually makes a similar point of caution about the allure of the symbol in his introduction to the lectures on the history of philosophy. Symbols and geometric representations, Hegel says, are mere images. They represent their object, but only abstractly and so incompletely. As such, they only go so far in guiding thought. Here Hegel mentions the circle specifically as it has been imagined according to the reciprocity model, the Ouroboros. Quote, "Thus it may be said that eternity is a circle, the snake that bites its own tail. This is only an image, but spirit does not require such a symbol. There are people who value such methods of representation, but these forms do not go far. The most abstract determination can indeed be thus expressed, but any further progress brings about confusion." Following this comment from Hegel on the limits of what I've called the reciprocity model, my aim here is not to reject this model in its entirety. My interest rather is to think more concretely about those aspects of Hegel's system that the reciprocity model presents only abstractly and thus incompletely. So to assist in clarifying what the reciprocity model I think fails to grasp, I turn to a passage from the Encyclopedia Logic, where Hegel offers a helpful analogy to illustrate the notion of circularity he envisions between being and the absolute idea. I'm going to use this analogy as the basis for a second model of circularity. So Hegel says, it can accordingly be said that the absolute idea is the universal, but the universal not merely as an abstract form opposite which the particular content stands as something other than it. Instead, it is the absolute form into which all determinations, the entire fullness of the content posited by it, have gone back. And here's the image that I'm using as the basis for my second model of circularity. Hegel says, in this respect, the absolute idea is comparable to the old man who says the same religious sentences as the child does. But for the old man, they have the meaning of his entire life. Even if the child understands the religious content, what validity that content has for him is still of the sort that lies outside his entire life and world. So on this model, the circularity of Hegel's system does not consist so much in the reciprocal relationship of its moments, but rather in the anamnestic activity in which these same moments are recollected within the context of one meaningful whole. Oops. So on this reading, through recollecting pure being, in light of its path of development, in the logic that the absolute idea achieves full determinacy as the true form of all reality. So the circle traversed here is one that leads from the end of the logic, the absolute idea, back to pure being, its supposedly immediate beginning. This anamnestic activity is a circling back to the beginning, but this is no mere return, because in circling back, the beginning is grasped concretely in light of its full developmental trajectory, including pure being, its first and most indeterminate form. In this sense, the backward movement of recollection is at the same time a forward advance that yields greater determinacy. It is, in Hegel's words, both a regressive founding and a progressive further determining. The circle that winds from logic to nature to spirit can also, I would suggest, be understood along the lines of the anamnesis model. Spirit does not become actual until it is able to comprehend its own activity in light of its ancestral past as logic. This activity is again a circling back to logic. But once again, it is a circling back that yields further determination insofar as this ancestral memory becomes mediated and clothed by the subsequent circles of nature and spirit. Now I'd like to return the problem of epistemic circularity that we earlier examined in connection with the reciprocity model to see whether the anamnesis model might offer us somewhat of a solution. So recall that Sextus Empiricus was concerned about any claim to knowledge that would require, on the one hand, that the object under investigation depend upon what ought to be confirmatory of that object, and that what ought to be confirmatory of the object of investigation depend upon the object under investigation itself. This was Sextus's problem with reciprocity, or the fifth mode. So how can this anamnesis model help resolve this problem of epistemic circularity or vicious circularity that was raised earlier by the Yirmibes? So here I would suggest that there's simply no problem in actually accounting for the transition or the derivation from one moment or part to another for Hegel. On this model, there is no independent or external other. The fifth mode of Agrippa suggests that the object under investigation and what ought to be confirmatory of the object under investigation are ontologically independent of each other. But on the anamnesis model, these are not ontologically independent of each other, but rather comprise one totality. After all, the child and old man on this model are linked together through recollection in the course of one life. Moreover, the child and old man are not only the same person, but they're linked together by virtue of the fact that they are considering the same text. So here I just don't think that the problem of epistemic circularity holds on the model of anamnesis. I would also suggest that we can, also, for the same reason, see the anamnesis model as helping to resolve the second problem that we considered in connection with the reciprocity model. So again, that problem was of how Hegel's claims regarding the circularity of his system can be reconciled with his claims concerning its progression or development. This is basically something that the reciprocity model seemed to rule out, is any kind of development. But of course, Hegel is arguing it's not just circular, but there's a development that goes on. So how, in other words, can Hegel think of a circle that is at the same time a line, right? Or how can Hegel think of a circle which is compatible with linear development? This is the problem of no development that I was bringing up earlier in connection with the reciprocity model. And the anamnesis model, I think, suggests an answer. So I quote from the Encyclopedia Logic, where Hegel is, of course, discussing recollection, one of his many discussions of it. He says, "When it is said in the Platonic philosophy that we recollect the ideas, this means that the ideas are undeveloped in human beings, and not, as the sophists maintained, something foreign to human beings that comes to them from the outside. Yet through this construal of knowing as recollection, the development of what is undeveloped in human beings is not ruled out. And this development is nothing but mediation." So here the suggestion is that the anamnesis model of circularity resolves the problem of no development the same way that Socrates' theory of recollection resolves Meno's paradox of learning. The paradox of learning from Plato's Meno hinges on the assumption of a strict separation between knowing and not knowing, a strict separation between knowledge and ignorance. The theory of recollection calls this assumption into question, suggesting rather that knowing and not knowing are linked together in one the same developmental process we call learning. Similarly, the anamnestic model of circularity denies that the moments comprising the circle of philosophical science are external to one another, suggesting instead that these moments are internally linked within one sequence or activity of development. So rather than permit only of endless repetition and alternation or fluctuation of the same, the anamnesis model suggests that a development can actually take place as the end winds back to the beginning. And here we are given to think of, I believe, a unilinear and irreversible development that occurs over the totality of one's life as one undergoes and reflects upon experience. So my suggestion here, therefore, is that the anamnesis model of circularity is one that can incorporate both the circle and the line, or we might say that sublates the figure of the circle and the line. And here is where I think Hegel's suggesting something of this sort when he's describing development, once again, in the beginning of the Science of Logic. This is right after some of the earlier quotes that I took from "With what must the beginning of science be made?" So Hegel says here, "In this advance, the beginning thus loses the one-sidedness that it has when determined simply as something immediate and abstract. It becomes mediated, and the line of scientific forward movement consequently turns into a circle." So here, Hegel is, I think, suggesting that the way he wants to think about circularity is in such a way that it has to be, in some way, compatible with linear development or with the figure of the line. All right. Now I have some questions or some problems that I'd like to kind of raise by way of conclusion here. The anamnesis model of circularity, first of all, obviously draws inspiration from the Platonic account of recollection. However, Socrates himself warns in the Meno that this notion of recollection is merely a story. So, from the Meno, here's Socrates speaking about recollection. He says, "I do not insist that my argument is right in all other respects, but I would contend at all costs in both word and deed, as far as I could, that we will be better men, braver and less idle, if we believe that one must search for the things one does not know, rather than if we believe that it is not possible to find out what we do not know and that we must not look for it." So it would seem from this account that Socrates is not necessarily willing to defend or justify this account of recollection. We might also consider in this connection Hegel's criticism of Plato's presentation of philosophy. As it stands at a relatively early stage in the historical development of the idea, Hegel warns that Plato's presentation of philosophy, including recollection, pales in comparison to later historical formulations, such as the kind that Hegel himself finds that he is uniquely positioned to provide. Right? So again here, if Hegel is kind of relying upon the figure of circularity from Socrates or from Plato, right, we might wonder, well, how we can square this with Hegel's concerns about the status of recollection as a story or as an image. We might also do well here to consider the various warnings that Hegel will give throughout his corpus on the status of images and representational thinking more generally. This is again from the Encyclopedia Logic. Hegel says, "Representations may generally be regarded as metaphors of thought and concepts. By merely having representations, however, we are not yet familiar with the meaning they have for thinking. That is, we are not familiar with their thoughts and concepts. Conversely, it is one thing to have thoughts and concepts, and another to know which representations, intuitions, feelings correspond to them." So at this point, I want to conclude just by voicing what are some unresolved questions that are occasioned by the reflections that I've put forward here today regarding the circularity of Hegel's system. So first of all, I would ask, does Hegel actually have a concept of circularity? I've tried to offer two ways of making sense of Hegel's invocation of the circle, but it remains, at least for me, an unresolved question whether it is right to say that Hegel even has a determinate concept of circularity. It is unclear whether this is a concept, which as such, we would expect Hegel to offer some sort of analysis or discussion or deduction concerning its reality, or whether Hegel would consider circularity a mere image or representation or even a narrative trope, which would fall short of conceptual clarity. So again, very basically, just trying to think about how Hegel wants us to understand the circle, raises this question of whether Hegel would even say that circularity is a concept that he's prepared to explain. But then secondly, this leads me to another question. Does Hegel actually need a concept of circularity? Regardless of whether he has one or not, does he require some kind of conceptual analysis or articulation of the circle? So does Hegel merely rely upon representation at crucial moments in his system? Are we to think that Hegel is in articulating what are crucial connections in his articulation between the parts of the system, the logic, etc.? Should we think that Hegel is merely here relying upon an image or representation? Something which, of course, by his own admission, would seem to problematize the scientific character of the system of philosophical sciences. So to put the same question, I think, a different way, does the notion of circularity allow for the closure of Hegel's system? Right? That's what I'm asking when I'm asking, does Hegel need a concept of circularity? if he just has a kind of symbol or a representation of circularity, which he's not able to deduce or prove or justify in any way, then again, does this idea of the circle, is his use of the circle, does it actually prevent him from closing the circle of the system in any kind of clear way? Or does this notion of circularity, as I said, prevent him from closing the loop that's meant to secure its scientific status, right? So, of course, I began with some quotes where Hegel is arguing that, of course, the scientific status of his system does not depend upon achieving some kind of presuppositionalist beginning, but of making this kind of circular course. And so I'm asking, does Hegel actually offer us a concept that would allow for this circular course to be successfully closed? And finally, I have one further question that I would raise here. If, as I've suggested, Hegel's invocation of circularity is rooted in the Platonic notion of recollection, well, in that case, to what extent should we see Hegel's invocation of the circle as an advance over Plato's? Hegel, of course, argues that ancient doctrines do not attain conceptual knowledge of subjectivity. And yet, Hegel is again and again throughout the philosophy of spirit and the logic utilizing this theory of recollection or depending upon it in some way. And so how can Hegel argue that ancient doctrines do not attain conceptual knowledge of subjectivity? So my last question, should we consider Hegel's appeal to circularity as merely repeating or returning to the same eternal and cyclical wisdom of the ancients, right? Does Hegel's attempt to kind of use this circle, does it actually mean that his philosophy is not able to attain the kind of development which by his own lights it's supposed to? Or should we rather see Hegel here as perhaps actualizing a notion of recollection that was not fully developed in ancient thought, precisely through recollecting it? All right, those are the questions that I have. So thank you very much for your attention, your patience. I appreciate it. So I'll turn it over to the organizers again.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much. So to ask the question, please just raise your hand. If you are not familiar with how to do it, just go down to where it says reactions, click on reactions, and you have the option to raise your hand. So, yes, Dylan, please go
ahead. Thank you. Thank you so much for that talk. Very interesting and I think probably indisputable in its conclusions. But I just want to ask you to say more maybe about a few things or maybe throw a few suggestions at you, especially in light of those questions you left us with at the end. So I was struck, right, the circle, for Hegel, the true infinite, as he describes it in the Science of Logic Existence chapter, is also represented, perhaps merely symbolically, by the circle, right? So the bad infinite is the line that goes on forever, we never get there. The infinite closes in on itself. And he says in the Encyclopedia Logic, the true infinite is the fundamental concept of philosophy, he says, which is kind of a crazy thing to say. And one way I've tried to make sense of that, why would he say something like that? Well, for Hegel, speculative reason is infinite thinking, he says also in the Encyclopedia Logic, as opposed to the understanding, which is merely finite thinking. So infinite thinking, and if the image of the infinite is somehow this circle, you know, then that would be in a way the very form of philosophy itself. So that's one suggestion. I wonder if you have a thought about that. And then about the Platonic side of things, something I'm very interested in, as folks may have learned last week, you know, anamnesis, again, also becomes a very important concept for the Neoplatonic uptake of Plato. That is, anamnesis describes the return of the philosopher to the intelligible world, which is, as Plotinus will say, our homeland. And he describes it, you know, the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, is a kind of symbolic representation of this journey, right? It's a circular journey that Odysseus returns back home which, you know, as T.S. Eliot says somewhere, to return home and know the place for the first time and that sort of thing. That's in a way the Hegelian move, I think, as well. So yes, maybe I wonder what if the sort of ontological or metaphysical stakes perhaps in the turn to Plato and the Neoplatonists, if you see that, though I take it the talk, right, had more of an emphasis on the epistemic questions about circularity, circular reasoning. Anyway, that's probably enough from me, so there you go.
Cool, thanks, Dylan. Really helpful questions, and I was hoping that you'd ask me something about Neoplatonism after hearing your talk. But I also, I'm not really super prepared to speak about Hegel and Neoplatonism as much as I'd like to. So let me just say that, yeah, I think that, you know, I absolutely think that this notion of kind of an anamnestic circularity is something that I would imagine that Hegel is receiving, right, by way to some extent of Neoplatonic thinkers like Plotinus and Proclus. I guess I'm just not really entirely sure about how that story emerges, and my research, at least so far, has really been about how Hegel is trying to think about really ancient skepticism, so Pyrrhonian skepticism, and, you know, Plato and Aristotle. So I really haven't just personally made it to think through, I think, those sets of issues. But I'll also say that, I mean, I do think that, you know, there's a lot to be said about, well, the various influences that go into Hegel's notion of circularity. I think that, you know, I think that we can see this in ancient philosophy, obviously, in Sextus Empiricus. I don't think we necessarily have to see it as coming from this one kind of root in Neoplatonic philosophy or something like this. Nevertheless, obviously, the Hermetic tradition, the Western mystical tradition, is going to obviously flow from this. And if you want to see, you know, Glenn McGee suggests, yeah, that Hegel takes the circle right from this tradition, right? And so he wants to say there's only this one kind of influence there. I'm just not sure about that yet. And I guess I'd also just say that for my own research interests, I kind of really quickly passed this by in the presentation, but, you know, Hegel, the notion of circularity that's built into the encyclopedia, the title of the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it, you know, encourages me to also, you know, see to what extent this kind of thinking of the circle in Hegel emerges from his engagement with the encyclopedic tradition. And I think there's some promising suggestions there. To go back to your first question about the true infinite, yeah, I mean, I think that this is the question that I've been, or one of the ways I've been kind of thinking about it myself is, well, yeah, Hegel doesn't have a concept of a circle, but he has a concept of the true infinite, or, you know, of absolute idea. So isn't that basically his concept of circularity? I think so. I'm not certain. I mean, that's the kind of suggestion I was making at the end, is that, well, Hegel maybe is, you know, recovering or recollecting, right? A undeveloped form of circularity from the ancient thinkers. And so, you know, perhaps we don't have to be looking for explicitly a concept of circle for Hegel, but maybe what the kind of deduction or proof for that concept would be something identical, more or less, with the true infinite or something. I don't know if that helps. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from Gail.
Hi. Well, thank you very much for your talk. My question is related to the concept of reciprocity and your reciprocity model, and how this concept is able to explain the concept of circularity. So for me, it wasn't quite clear why you used the concept of reciprocity, because I think you put a quote on the screen at the end of the logic, and this is also what I would have expected, before listening to your talk, that you would pick up a very important notion that relates to the notion of circularity, namely the notion of the method, right? Because this is also like at the end of the logic, the notion of circularity is introduced in relation and very strong link to the notion of the method. And so obviously the method is like the core of the idea of method is the notion or the concept of the concept, like universality, particularity, individuality, so on and so forth. So why haven't you focused on the method and on the concept of the concept, rather than focusing on the concept of reciprocity? That's the question.
Cool, thanks for the question. Yeah, I mean, I think that if I were to work this up into, an article or something like that, that's precisely the kind of thing that I'd want to do. For this talk, I'll just say that this talk, I saw the abstract, I saw the call for abstracts, and I was like, you know what? I want to put together some of the thoughts, that I haven't yet put together over the years about these things, try to, have this as an opportunity to think these things through. So I came up with the notion of reciprocity because I thought that it was a pretty familiar way of thinking about circularity. But I think as I've been trying to suggest, Hegel does want to, I think, consider this idea of reciprocity as really a bad form of circularity. And so I guess what I was trying to do in the first part of the presentation through suggesting we think of circularity in terms of relationship of reciprocity is really just trying to inject back into Hegel's notion of circularity the kinds of philosophical concerns that emerge from him in the Logic of Essence, right? So here, I do try to address method to the extent that Hegel wants to say that, well, reciprocity is not really going to quite do it for us, right? So I guess as a matter of, rather than treating of the concept too specifically, I figured that, well, maybe it might be clear to show through the via negativa of kind of what's missing from this, I think, again, very, very familiar way of thinking of circularity, a bad circularity, a vicious circularity, of the circularity that Trendelenburg imputes to Hegel, for instance. But I wanted to try to think, what is it they're kind of missing there? So anyway, thanks for the question. And that's, certainly where I'd go next.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question is from Peter.
So in your talk, you focused upon epistemological circularity as you find in sort of the modes of Agrippa. But I was wondering to what degree Hegel might be aiming for something like an ontological circularity rather than an epistemological circularity. And I think this relates to the degree to which he separates himself from Fichte. That Fichte obviously is attempting like an absolute epistemological foundation for a system of philosophy. But it seems to me at least that insofar as Hegel attempts to go back to someone like Aristotle or Plato, he does so on the grounds of looking for absolute ontological foundations rather than epistemological ones. And it seems to me at least that we could argue that he has a kind of ontological circularity, if not obviously an epistemological one. And I was wondering what you thought of this.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Absolutely. So I certainly don't want to give the impression that I'm reading Hegel as merely advocating for some sort of epistemological circularity, or that the circularity system is narrowly epistemological in nature. I reject that. What I was trying to suggest is rather that I think this kind of concern about epistemic circularity is essentially based on a specious or bad ontological conception of circularity. And so what I was trying to suggest is that, well, maybe we can do away with some of these concerns about epistemic circularity being a problem for Hegel if we recognize that he's not really concerned with the same sort of circularity that would ground or justify that epistemic concern. So I'm with you, absolutely. I think that Hegel is absolutely trying to articulate a circle, or a circle that's epistemologically and ontologically salient. So absolutely, I agree with that.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from Rob.
Thanks very much, Miles, for your presentation. Nice to see you. Yeah, it relates to the question we've just had, I suppose, because I can't but think that there are epistemic issues, in play here, right? In that you pulled out that passage from with what must the beginning of the science be made about essential to the sciences, not so much the beginning as a pure immediacy, but the whole thing as a circle, right? And what Hegel's doing, right, in the science of logic is he's making a case for something, right? He's making a case for a certain kind of, idealist metaphysics, and he's saying that my results, have the status of a science, which is to say, they're sort of certain, right? They've been derived or they've been proven, and so it looks as though from that passage at least, right, the circularity thing, however you understand it, it has something to do with making a scientific case for understanding what is as pure idea, or however you want to gloss the conclusion of the logic, right? And I can see why someone might think on what you call the reciprocity or model, that has to do with justifying, with making the case, right? And I agree with you that I don't think that there's a way of making that work. I agree with you that I don't think that there's Hegel is saying, what I have to say about the absolute idea or the concept is justified because it's part of this big sort of circle. Nor for that matter, should the circle be appealed to in this kind of reciprocal manner to justify where the account begins. Neither end, I agree with you. I think get rid of that, right? What I haven't quite understood is, so one thing, right? Circularity has something to do with making the case. So there are for Hegel's conclusions in a scientific manner. So there's a kind of justificatory question in play. The second thing, I think that some of the passages you pulled out made a really good case for understanding circularity as anamnesis in some sense, right? That it has to do with recalling the beginning from the end. It has to do with recognizing that where you started from was sort of one-sided, and where you've got to at the end is the same thing, but mediated and understood properly, and all the rest of it. I guess I don't see, even though all of that's fine, how that helps to make the case for the conclusions. How the fact that the end is sort of what the beginning was, but no longer one-sided and now sort of properly understood. I don't see what contribution that makes to Hegel saying, and thus the results of my treatment of logic and ontology are scientifically, valid. I think I agree with the case you made. I just don't quite see how it helps. It's obviously meant to, but I don't get it.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I appreciate the question for sure. And yeah, I mean, I think that you raise something that I still haven't quite figured out myself. I was really trying to turn to anamnesis because I recognized that the same kind of ontological problem in Meno's paradox would be precisely the kind of problem that Hegel would want to overcome here. And it seems that Hegel's constantly appealing to anamnesis, right, or recollection, constantly throughout his philosophy, in some sense as a way of trying to justify it or prove it. How we should think about anamnesis as a proof procedure, exactly, I'm not certain, but I guess what I've been trying to suggest at least is within an anamnestic account, there's not this kind of ontological problem of dualism, right? Or of the problem, let's say, like that Sextus raises within the two modes or something like this, right? So I'm not sure exactly how it's going to offer us some kind of way of justifying this, but I also want to say that, Hegel is really trying to tweak significantly how we think about justification, how we think about proof. And obviously, I think that his notion of presupposition, right, which is bound up with his notion of anamnesis, I think is the way he tries to get there. I'm not certain, I guess how to answer your question just yet. But I do think that, we want to make this kind of connection between, okay, Hegel's saying this stuff is necessary. It's true, it's scientific, it's proved, it's derived, right? And we want to say that has something to do with this kind of procedure that requires anamnesis or something like this. But exactly what that's going to, how that's going to justify it, I mean, I'm just not certain exactly what, I'm still not certain what are the justificatory requirements or standards that Hegel himself sees himself as responsible for meeting. And, you know, here I've tried to just raise a lot of questions about this, but I mean, that's the basic question that I still can't seem to get around is, you know, precisely what are the very requirements that Hegel would think that circularity could raise as a requirement to promise or guarantee its scientific necessity. So anyway, this is just to say, I don't know, Rob. I'm still thinking it through, but you know, I do think that I don't know. I mean, maybe thinking about what Kevin was offering in terms of his analysis of the syllogism would be a helpful place to think about this. I know Angelica Nuzzo has written pretty extensively on recollection and anamnesis in Hegel, but at present I'm not sure what to say personally. Thanks for the good question, though.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Dino.
Hi, thank you so much. This was great. I kind of have a series of half-baked worries about anamnesis. So if you will allow it, I'm going to try to organize them. So one is basically, I mean, one of the ways you motivated this is you said, well, you know, circle is crucial, so you know, let's try to get this circle out. And I'm sympathetic to that, but I can't see it, right? Because, for example, also, you know, what Hegel says at one point, well, you know, the logic can be understood as the mind of God before creation, right? Then we can say, okay, so we need to get the concept of the mind of God of before of creation, right? So let's look at that. Now, this is not really a criticism, but I guess, as I said, half-baked worries, right? So basically, the idea is that you know, you did mention yourself that we are, or Hegel says that we are at risk of getting distracted by images, right? Now, one issue I have with that, with anamnesis and images, is maybe comes from the way I understand the Meno. And the way I understand the Meno is that anamnesis is itself an image, right? As you said, it's not, Plato says, you know, it might not be true that souls actually transmitigate or something, but the way it seems to me is to say, well, how can you ever know that you know anything, right? Or how can you recognize geometrical truths? And well, it's kind of like when you remember stuff, right? You forget stuff, and then you don't remember it, and then it comes to your mind, and it's kind of clear in front of your mind, right? So what it seems to me we might be doing is we might be kind of imposing images on images. Now, if Hegel reads anamnesis in a more literal sense, then my worry is dispelled. Another thing is, you know, you said it resolves certain problems, and I think it seems to do, but also I guess we get different problems such as, you know, who recollects, right? And I guess the issue of logical time, I haven't heard about this issue a while, right? So what is the logical time, right? And it seems to me that anamnesis does require some sort of linearity of logical time, right? So being comes before, or, you know, something like that. So then a suggestion, what about, so if we have the recollective circularity, reciprocal circularity, what about organic circularity, right? So nothing to throw out. So that we look at circularity as a kind of organic unity. And to finish, I've been speaking too long, but to finish, do you see any connection between recollective circularity and hermeneutic circularity? No, that's a bit anachronistic, but I was just curious. Okay, thank you so much.
Great, thank you for all those questions. Really good ones, not too half-baked at all, or else the questions that I'm posing are half-baked also. So no, absolutely. So first of all, you know, I do think that there are problems with the anamnesis model. So that's kind of the way I set this paper up, is that I don't think that the reciprocity way of thinking about circularity really works at all. But I'm looking for, okay, well, what else does Hegel offer us as a way of trying to understand what he means by this circular path that the method travels, that the system, is comprised of, etc. And so I'm trying to think about anamnesis, but I absolutely think that it's a problem if this is, or at least it's a problem that maybe not a vicious, damning problem, insurmountable problem, but it's a problem, at least, as you say, that aren't we just kind of putting images upon images here if we're relying upon this? And that's why I was raising at the end the question of, I mean, if this is how Hegel is suggesting that we think circularity, isn't this a problem insofar as it's really not offering us any clear conceptual clarity, but it's relying upon something already, right, already represented, right? So I would just say that, yeah, I'm not sure about I mean, I suggested at the end that perhaps, you know, as Hegel would say that this kind of notion of anamnesis from ancient philosophy is only kind of undeveloped itself in the way that it was comprehended by Plato, and that it's not until, right, we're in the position in the 19th century to read the logic of the concept and the absolute method that we're able to recognize, right, how to think about anamnesis itself clearly. That's one way we could possibly proceed. I'm not sure if that's the best solution yet, but, you know, again, what I want to show here is that, you know, I think that through thinking about circularity, you know, I think there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of pressure that's put on a lot of points in Hegel's philosophy. So let me see, just one more thing about logical time. I guess what I'll say is, I mean, the interesting thing with recollection is that there's a return to a past that was never present, right? It's a return to a past that never had existed except for through this kind of return. And so, I mean, I guess what I'm interested in the figure of anamnesis or memory here is the way that, you know, in recollecting or remembering, we're not just ever simply going back to some kind of original or kind of independent point, but, right, we're always kind of, you know, memory is always productive as well, right? Whenever we're remembering, there's also kind of a new determination, right, or novelty potentially baked in here, which is why I was thinking about, this is maybe an interesting way to approach the question posed by the conference about, you know, well, how do we understand this circle, right? Does this circle really just a kind of like endless eternal return of the same, or is there some way that, you know, there's a possibility of new development, of progression beyond just kind of like, you know, the fixed circle or something like this? So I want to say that anamnesis does offer us, you know, some way of seeing how something new or some kind of greater determination can emerge from this attempt to go back. And in terms of the hermeneutic circle, yeah, I mean, this is something that that I was thinking about initially when I was first putting together this presentation. And I mean, it does seem to me that if we're thinking about, I don't know, Gadamer or something like this, that the kind of, you know, circular motion of understanding that begins with a kind of foreconception or a presupposition, which then becomes itself greater kind of comprehended, right, through this kind of moving back. I would say if that's what we want to get out of the hermeneutic circle, then I think that's quite similar to, or at least compatible with this anamnesis model that I've suggested. But again, you know, I think there's some problems here that we should definitely raise, right, related to representation itself when we're thinking through this anamnesis model. So thanks.
Thank you very much. Next question is from George.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed that. I just have a kind of few general comments to make about correlating Plato and Hegel in a sort of general sense. I think one thing you want to be on the lookout for is taking the eikos muthos of Plato, the likely story, which I think would be the aspects of Plato that Hegel would identify as the more speculative moments, right? The sort of moments where we're reaching sort of the reality of, you know, the mind and everything that Hegel would talk about as speculative. I think there's a danger in going from that and then saying, oh, Plato uses you know, this sort of story, so therefore he's doing representationalism. Right. I mean, so you can say, well, you know, the very fact that there is the tendency when Socrates is going into this mode, right, where he says, oh, well, you know, I can't really tell you, but here's a likely story, right? You know, before launching into these different sort of allegories, you know, I think there's a hesitancy that maybe the form isn't adequate to the content, but Plato knows that, right? And that's kind of he knows that he's stretching the limits of form and content in doing that. So then I guess the question becomes, well, this notion of development in Hegel, I think that this is the strongest link between Plato and Hegel. And I love those passages from the Encyclopedia Logic you cited, because I think that makes it really, really explicit. I know generally people kind of say, Hegel's more Aristotelian and look at the way the encyclopedia ends and so forth. But I think in this one aspect of development is a really key link. And the way I've kind of mapped this out for myself is you begin with the abstract sort of doxa of the people on the street, right? So for Hegel, you're beginning from a somewhat different standpoint. You're beginning with the understanding of natural science in the, early 19th century. That's like the understanding that Hegel's beginning with. But, it's still a sort of, a similar methodologically, right? You're taking external natural things and applying, classical logic to them and sort of trying to get these results. So you're beginning with this sort of, naturalistic, abstract common understanding. And then, you're putting in this negative element, right? And for Socrates, in the lectures on the history of philosophy, some great passages on Socrates as, the sort of negative spur to self-consciousness, right? So the dialectical spur to self-consciousness. I think you're kind of already in that transitional moment when Socrates is questioning people, right? When he's sort of getting at the doxa. Now, what Plato does with dialectic is, complicated, and how it relates to Hegel's is, I'm not going to quite go there, but I think even if you just take the moment of Socrates questioning and sort of, he's dismantling the representations, right? He's destroying these representations, and then by the time we get to the Eikos Muthos, we're trying to kind of build them back up, right? So there's a whole process of development by the time we get there, and that I think is a key aspect of the anamnesis, right? Well, I mean, it's a little bit difficult because sometimes, Plato does talk about it in different ways. In some sense, anamnesis is also correlated with this sort of geometric understanding, because the Greek is the dianoia. So it's just kind of, you can understand these, but Hegel does put that below dialectic on the divided line, right? That's another thing to consider too. So is anamnesis, I think he would also say that, knowledge of the forms is also recollected, but at least in its initial introduction, it's correlated with this sort of geometrical understanding, right? So that's also an ambiguity with anamnesis, right? I think there's a more speculative anamnesis and maybe just anamnesis of images. There's a really good article from Lawrence Bruce Robertson on the Platonic dimensions of Hegel's system, where he talks about this sort of idea of development as unifying them too. Yeah, that was all I had. I'm curious, if you think of the moment when, we're going back to imagery for Plato as a sort of speculative moment, and you brought up McGee too. I thought that was good because McGee has an argument that the final moment is not as hostile to imagery as we might think in Hegel, right? So he kind of tries to recover this idea that, imagery is not all representation. So I'm curious, my sort of suggestion would just be maybe, the critique of representation is based on its point in development and not on imagery as such, right? And I think that's what Plato is also wrestling with. It's not based on, you can't tell stories, you can't use images, we have to discard all the myths, but are our myths self-reflective and critical, and do they involve thought, versus are they just what everyone's babbling about on the street? Thank you for the talk.
Thanks, George. Really great questions. I really appreciate those. Yeah, so that's kind of where I've been going is what you're suggesting. I think in the end about whether, Hegel would want to say that there's a speculative use of images that is in any way helpful. Obviously, it's still going to be, deficient if we're understanding it in comparison with conceptual representation or determination. But no, I do think that, this is also maybe the question for me in Hegel's use of recollection is, precisely, is there a concept here or is it a story? And if it's a story, is that a problem? So I completely agree with you. The concerns about representation are not necessarily the same concerns related to stories. And when I was originally thinking through this, what I ended up calling anamnesis circularity, for a little while I was considering calling it narrative circularity or something like this, precisely because I think that's what Hegel's trying to get out of this notion of anamnesis is a kind of narrative circularity where one is able to recall for oneself, to oneself, right, within a single story, right, all of the kind of events or movements that happen in there. So I do think that, I don't know, a certain notion of narrative circularity might be helpful. And, for that, we might look at like someone like Cyril O'Regan, who I think does offer us something like a notion of narrativity, right, in his thinking about Hegel as offering a circle. So I think it's a good question. I don't think necessarily the issues with representation itself, but rather where this kind of representation lies on a developmental trajectory within the history of philosophy or something like this. And I really like how you put this in terms of, Socrates beginning with the doxa and then trying to, obviously finding the aporia or the kind of problem there, and whether or not there's a speculative moment. I would say that it's also Aristotelian, I would say. I mean, not necessarily the notion of anamnesis itself, but this kind of this methodological move of beginning with what's clearest to us, with what's most familiar to us, and proceeding to what is clearest in itself, right? This is Aristotle's kind of method, if we want to say. So this is just to say that, I mean, I don't know that this is a point where I want to insist upon some kind of difference between Plato and Aristotle for Hegel or something like this. But yeah, I guess I do think that at least Hegel's invocation of anamnesis requires us to try to take seriously a notion of development that I think you're suggesting might come along with telling a story or a narration. But that's all I got at this point. But really good questions. They're really helpful. And I'll have to ask you for that reference later for that article, which I've not heard of or read.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from Filip.
Yes, hello. I hope you can hear me well. And all right. Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. And I just want to give like a really short maybe hint or something or a different view. Because we've been talking about circularity as a concept a lot, or I heard the word concept a lot. And one of your questions you raised at the end was, where does he get that concept from? Is it a method? Does he deduce it from somewhere, or what is it? Yeah. And on the other hand, we've been talking about circularity as a symbol, and maybe, just maybe, I mean, of course, he's talking about circles a lot. It's definitely a topic, right? But maybe, just maybe, it's just a symbol too with Hegel. And what I mean by that is, if you think of the beginning of the logic, what Hegel claims, I mean, this is really one of the crucial points, right? But he claims that it's not him making stuff up. He claims that in German it is die Sache, the thing itself is moving, the idea is moving, and he's just watching it, right? And watching the system, maybe system-wise, that may be a circle, but is the thing itself a circle? Like he puts that concept on the thing and says, look, this is my theory, this is in a circle, because I'm watching the whole. But what I'm just trying to say is that if you overthink, or if you think too much system-wise, you may be getting it wrong. You're sticking too. I hope you get what I'm trying to say here, and I think it's kind of. I think it was Pirmin Stegler said that it's not always about the system. If you're trying to push everything into the system, then it's not what's happening. Yeah. Just a hint, kind of a hint, just what I was thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I do appreciate it. This is something that I was trying to think about a bit with this, this talk about, to what extent am I leaning too heavily on this symbol? To what extent is Hegel leaning too heavily on this symbol? That was sometimes confusing. But I guess I'll say that, yeah, I mean, I think that why I want to suggest that Hegel maybe wants to have a concept of circularity, or needs to have something like a concept rather than just a symbol, well, is because, I mean, thinking about the theme of this conference and the question of the conference, so what actually happens, right? What actually happens? Where do these circles actually lead? And so for me, when I was first putting this together, I was like, well, does Hegel have one way of thinking of a circle, or does he have different circles? And I wanted to suggest that, well, if Hegel is using this symbol again and again and again through all these different parts of his philosophy, he probably has something pretty similar in mind. So total just assumption up front going into this presentation, I assume that by circle, Hegel means the same thing, right? And is thinking the same thing kind of consistently. And I think that it's something that he would be able to give some kind of account for. And if he's relying upon it to make these arguments, which again, maybe he's not relying upon it as much as I suggested, well, wouldn't we at least want some kind of explanation of this? So I think that he needs a concept of circularity, or at least some kind of account of circularity, because I think it's hard to make sense of what we do with all these various appeals to the circle, whether in method or truth or the system, without something like this. But I take your point about maybe, trying to look too hard for some kind of systematic justification for this. Maybe it doesn't need it. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. If I may ask the last question, since we don't have any more, it's okay now. I just wanted to say something a bit more on the use of the term recollection. When you were responding to George's question, you said that it invites us to take seriously the notion of development. And something that that you made me think about is something that I noticed recently in Hegel's, in the introduction to the Science of Logic prefaces and in various other parts, where Hegel emphasizes the importance of doing the logic at this point in history, where we have this whole series of determinations behind us. We have this whole development of philosophy, of science, of art, of history, and we're not starting from an unknown. We're starting from a very much known place. We've got all these concrete determinations to draw on. And I wonder if this could also be a way to think of recollection for Hegel, that recollection is a way to talk about how, in the science of logic, now that we're trying to sort of figure out how all the determinations that we have are meant to necessarily fit together, we're sort of recollecting, in a sense, everything that we already know, but in its proper sense, in how it's properly meant to fit with each other. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's. I think that if I'd taken a little bit longer to try to draw out and explain kind of how I'm trying to think about this anamnesis model of circularity, I mean, it's really the logic that I was thinking most of all about and what I am most familiar with. No, I do think that we can think about these kinds of forms of thought, beginning with them in their kind of undeveloped or immediate form, right? Working them out to their greater determinacy, right, as a kind of recollective process. I think that's absolutely what's going on. And I think that Hegel would say as much. Maybe one problem would be that, at the beginning of the Science of Logic, of course, there is something like maybe total loss of memory, though, if we're kind of following Hegel's systematic development, right, from, say, the philosophy of spirit to the logic, right? Is there something which can be properly kind of remembered at the beginning here, or does, I mean, I want to say that perhaps the science of logic, beginning with pure, immediate, indeterminate, fictive being, right? It's beginning with something at least familiar, right? But it's beginning with something which maybe cannot be recovered at the beginning, at least. So the extent to which we're beginning with something known might be, not quite right at that point. But I guess I'll just also say that, I was thinking through this presentation. I was also trying to think about, well, there's other ways of thinking about circles, say like, or the notion of circularity beyond maybe where Hegel arrived in in his time, right? If we want to think about, like, say, how geometry is developed post Hegel or something like this, then certainly perhaps we would have to come up with new, more familiar circles to begin with if we're thinking about this. But anyway, that's just another kind of aside. But no, absolutely. I think that, yeah, I mean, I do think that that's what I'm suggesting is the absolute idea, right, is right, undertaking this recollective process, right, where it's only at the very end where what was only abstractions, right, comprehended as incompletely are understood in their full development. So I think that's just to say that I think that I agree with you about that kind of use of recollection, but I think there's a lot more to be said about that.
Yeah, just one last thing I would say is I do think this is where the approach, the method, and the science of logic is different to the memo, and it is that I really do think that Hegel sort of has 1 foot in memory and 1 foot in forgetting, whereas Socrates is just, he's forgotten everything and he's trying to remember. But yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good question, or that's a good point. Rather nice point. Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. Thank you everyone for your participation, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Bye-bye.